Module 5, The Early Church. Part 1, an overview. We're going to overview the early church in this module. We're going to look at how it grew and expanded after Jesus had come, lived, died, taught, and trained, and then he had commissioned his disciples, and he goes back, of course, to heaven. What happens with those that he trained? How do they carry the message of the gospel forward? That's what we're going to look at in this module, Module 5. But I wanted to just touch briefly on some of the key ideas from the previous module, because we talked about the church in Module 4. And we wanted to make sure that we laid some of the important foundations down before we then see how it unfolds in the biblical timeline. So Module 4 was about the church. Some of the key ideas we had talked about, we'd actually broken it up into some pretty key areas. The first one we talked about, what is the criteria for the church? And that was very simply being in Christ. We trust in the work of Christ through faith, and that makes us a member of the church. When we get to the second one, the community, we talk about how everyone is equal. And that was the idea that regardless of your background, whether Jew or Gentile, in Christ, that is our new primary identity, and we are all equal regardless of whether we are a man or woman, Jew or Gentile, any of that. All of those still exist, but they're secondary, because this new community of being in Christ, this new community of being part of the church, is now our primary identity. The new reality we also talked about, and that is this idea that we have forgiveness and access, that the cross has made us children of God through faith, and because of that, the obstacles that existed previously have been abolished, and Christ has opened for us the path to God that is open, and so we can approach God with boldness and joy due to our access and forgiveness. We also talked about the inheritance, this idea that the covenant blessings that we had spent so long talking about that were for Israel are now available to everybody who is in Christ, Jew or Gentile alike. The result is this idea of a personal inward transformation where the Spirit of God comes into us and leads us from the inside out, and it is no longer we do things based on the law, but that the idea of truly being part of the church is we get to serve, we get to love, we get to do things that please God. It is no longer law that we have to, but we are transformed from the inside out to where we desire that, and we really seek that out ourselves. And then we talked about the call, which is this idea that we're not just saved and forgiven and transformed for our own sake, but there's a mission before us that God has really called us to be a part of, and we are His agents here on earth to partner with Him as the Spirit moves and to really advance His purposes on earth. And we're going to really see how that started with the early church in this module. So that's exactly where we're going now. We are going to do an overview of the early church. We're going to really look at what happened as the church grew and expanded. So what I want to do first, as we go into our next unit, I wanted to kind of pause real quick, because we've been talking a lot about the life of Christ. We've really gone deep looking at His life, and we haven't really touched on our timeline in a while and our geography. So what I want to do in the next unit is just kind of do a quick review of where we've come from so far from the perspective of the geography and the timeline. So in our next unit, we're going to do just that. We're going to review quickly the timeline and the geography, which will set us up to really begin to look forward now at what happens and where the work of God through the church and through the apostles and through the church that's growing, where that now continues to go. So join me in Unit 2.